Can keeping a nature diary help you to improve your wildlife identification skills? Well, yes, I think it can. So if you wanted a quick response, then that's my opinion on it. But if you want to stick around for the rest of this video, I am going to be sharing with you why and how keeping a nature diary might help you to improve your wildlife ID skills. So, why might you want to identify wildlife in the first place? Well, for me, I love nature, and identifying wildlife just helps me to appreciate it all the more. I loved nature when I was younger, and I love it even more now. And the difference is, I know a little bit more about what's going on around me, and I feel like that just changes things. Every time I go for a walk, I feel like I have a better understanding of the wildlife that's near me. I feel a bit more connected to nature. I know what's going on. And so I get a lot more out of my walks and my trips in nature when I understand a little bit more about it. So for me, it's definitely a skill that I want to keep on building. And I think that's another thing I like about it. The fact that you never stop learning when it comes to nature because there's so much out there, then how can you possibly know it all? There's always going to be something new for you to learn. But that is also a bit of an issue when it comes to wildlife identification because there is so much to learn. So, as much as that is a great thing because it means your hobby is like a never ending one and you're always going to have something new to discover, it's also a challenge because how do you know where to start? And how can a nature diary like this one help you to get a head start with wildlife ID? So I think keeping a nature diary is a great idea for lots of reasons, but the first one that we're going to start with in this video is that it encourages you to spend a bit of time outside. Don't get me wrong, I learn a lot from field guides while I'm sitting indoors and just flicking through the pages. I have lots of different field guides for many different species and I do use them and I think they're very helpful. But I tend to prefer using them once I've been outside and I've seen something and then I want to check up and see what it is, rather than trying to read them cover to cover and retain all that information because I know there's no way I'm going to remember all of that. And I think getting outside gives you a totally different appreciation for the thing that you're looking at because you're seeing it in real life. You're not seeing a picture of it, you're seeing it out where it's supposed to be. And that gives you a much better understanding of what that species looks like and where it lives and what kind of habitat it's in. And you get that from being outside and experiencing it for yourself. And when I'm doing my nature diary, it encourages me to get outside and to visit all of these places. You don't have to go anywhere exotic. You don't have to go really far away to go and find some inspiration for your nature diary. A lot of the things that I paint tend to be things I've found in my local area. But just the fact that I'm outside really helps me when it comes to identifying these things. I think seeing things in person is good for a number of reasons. The first is that sometimes things don't always look exactly as you think they will when you've seen a picture in a book. Going out and seeing it in person gives you a totally different appreciation of it. It might be a little different to how you imagined. The second reason seeing things in person is helpful for me is that you can use more of your senses to try and build up a picture of exactly what the species is. So you're not just looking at a picture and trying to commit that to memory. You are also listening. Maybe you can hear bird calls that you can use to help identify, or grasshoppers chirping. Maybe the flower you're looking at has a really distinctive scent that helps you to remember it. I don't know, but you get to use all of your senses together to really build up a good picture of what that species is like rather than just relying on a single image. And the third reason I think it's helpful being outside and seeing these things for yourself is that you get to see things in their habitat. And so even if you're not consciously making an effort to notice that, over time I feel like you tend to build up this subconscious picture of where you've seen all these species before, and so you start to build up an idea of where you might be likely to come across them again. Like, are you seeing flowers that normally occur in woodlands or in more boggy areas? Are you looking at birds that are normally at the coast or further inland? You're starting to build up an idea of where these species live, and it's all adding to that picture. And for me, I really remember things a lot more when I know a bit more about them rather than just trying to memorize the name and what it looks like. I think that really helps you to feel more connected to nature as well as improving your wildlife ID skills. So the second reason for me for why a nature diary might be helpful in improving ID skills is that it encourages you to restrict how many things you're trying to learn in one go, because there's only so much room in your nature diary. And if your nature diary is 4 by 4 inches, there's even less room. So you really have to restrict what you're going to be looking at. So for my nature diary, every time I go out, I try and look for maybe 4 or 5, 6 different species that I want to try and include for that particular trip, because any more and I'm just not going to fit it in the book. So I have to really narrow down what I'm going to be focusing on. And that is really helpful when it comes to wildlife ID, because one of the challenges when you're just starting out is there is so much out there that how do you know where to start? Like if you go out on a summer's day and you are surrounded by wildflowers, you've got birds flying overhead, you have grasshoppers and crickets chirping in the grass, you've got butterflies flitting around, bees, dragonflies, damselflies, there's all sorts going on out there. How do you know what to concentrate on? If you try and learn absolutely everything, you're probably going to get a bit overwhelmed with it, and it's going to be hard for that to stay in your mind. So having a nature diary means that you really have to narrow things down, and you have to pick a couple of species, because you can't include every single thing that you see. You would be there forever. And there are lots of different reasons why a species might make the cut and make it into your nature diary. It could be that it's just very pretty and you think it would make a nice painting. It might be that it's the first time you've seen that species that year, it's a brand new species that you've not noticed before, or it could just be a species that you have a fond memory of. Maybe it really stood out to you as you were wandering around and that's why you decide to include it. Either way, you're going to have to narrow your focus down and choose just a couple of species to include, and that is going to make things a lot easier. So how that might work is you head out to find some inspiration for your nature diary. You choose things based on what you think would look nice or what you want to include. Whether or not you know it or not is irrelevant. Just choose some things that you think would work well and then put them in your nature diary. And you can use that time to try and identify those things. But instead of trying to identify absolutely every single thing you saw on your walk, you're restricting yourself to only trying to identify the things that you're going to include. Last week, I was surrounded by bees. Maybe not last week, no, a few more weeks ago. At some point, I was surrounded by bees. They were on a goat willow tree, and I was trying to record some of them, and there were lots of different types, but the only one that I got really good footage of was a buff-tailed bumblebee, and at the time I didn't know what it was because I'm not so great with bees just yet. I would like to try and improve that. And so I recorded my video and I headed home and I looked it up and I tried to figure out what that particular bee was. Now, I could have made life difficult for myself and tried to take photos of every single bee that I saw on that tree, but I decided just to focus on the one that I already had a nice video on. And now hopefully I'm going to remember what that bee looks like. So the next time I come across a buff-tailed bumblebee, I'm going to know what it is. And that just makes life a lot easier than having tried to go out and identify every single thing I saw at that time. So you're just restricting yourself, narrowing your focus, and trying to learn just a couple of species at a time. And then when you head out into nature the next week or whenever, however often you decide to do this, you can look for those species again and see if you can recognize them. And then you will also be able to tell if you've seen something slightly different. And having a nature diary gives you a really good natural progression. So each time you go out, you're looking for the next couple of species to include. When I do my nature diaries, I don't always like to paint the same thing week in, week out. I want a little bit of variety to make it more interesting. So I am going to be looking for new species each time. And I might see some things that are familiar and it will remind me of what I did the time before. But I'm also looking for something new to include. And so week on week, or however often you choose to do this, you're slowly building up a picture of what's around you, and you're kind of building up this database of all this wildlife that you're learning just a little bit at a time. The third reason doing a nature diary can be helpful for your wildlife ID is that you're spending a bit more time with these species than you would do if you were just trying to quickly look things up online and then move on. You are spending time sketching everything out and painting everything in detail, and you are really getting to know that species. This is not a super quick process. I mean, maybe it's quite quick depending on how you paint, I don't know, but It's not as quick as just looking something up and then that being the last you ever think about it. When I do that, it's very difficult for me to retain that information. But when I'm painting things, I'm spending a bit more time trying to get things right. So maybe I'm counting the number of petals, maybe making sure I get that right, or I'm looking at the specific colors or the structure of something. And that is allowing me to spend a bit more time with that species and really get to know it, so that I'm more likely to remember what that looks like when I'm out the next time. Maybe I remember painting its leaves, or maybe I remember painting the plumage of a particular bird that helps me to separate it out from a similar species. It just gives you a little bit more time to spend that quality time with that species, trying to figure out what it is, which is useful in the long term of trying to actually retain that information. You could even be very deliberate about this and make sure that you're counting the petals as you're painting them, or looking at the specific features of a species, so that you're really thinking about it properly as you're painting it to try and retain as much information as possible. Either way, it is a good way of trying to retain that information, as opposed to just very briefly looking something up and then hoping that that stays in your mind, which for me doesn't really work that often. And all of these things really just help you to start building up a bit of an appreciation for the things that you come across the most regularly. You're starting to build up a good baseline knowledge that you can then build from. You're understanding what's in your local area, what you come across really regularly, and that way you start to notice when you see something new that stands out and you think, I haven't seen that there before. And so you start to be able to focus in on the things that you want to try and look at in a little bit more detail, rather than being overwhelmed by everything seeming really new and strange and not really knowing where to start. You're now building up a bit of a baseline and you're keeping a record of it. This is becoming like your own little field guide full of the things that you have seen. So each time you come across something new, you can check back in your little nature diary, see if you've seen it before. And if you haven't, you'll notice that that's the species that you should concentrate on this time. And I think that's just a really nice way of learning wildlife. You're doing it a little bit at a time in a really natural way, just picking up bits and pieces as you go, rather than trying to overwhelm yourself by learning absolutely everything there is to know in a very short space of time. If learning wildlife still feels a bit intimidating and you're not entirely sure where to start, one thing that you could consider is maybe focusing in on one group of species to begin with. Now, I know you might not want to do that. I know that as a bit of a keen naturalist myself, I like to know all the things and I don't want to just focus on one species, but sometimes that can be a nice introduction into everything else. I started out with butterflies because I love butterflies, and there's a relatively small number of them in the UK compared to some other places, so it seemed like a manageable place to begin. And I just tried to learn as much as I could about butterflies so that I could start recognizing them very easily. And then from there, you start to expand. So I would then try and learn some of the plants that went along with those butterflies, because they were the food plants of the caterpillars, and I wanted to try and figure out where those butterflies might occur. Or you might then want to move on to day flying moths, because you've noticed that there are things out there that aren't your butterflies and you want to know what they are. So that gives you like the next step. And then you might move on to macro moths. If you really wanted to go further into the moth route, you could look at micro moths, but that seems like it would be a bit of a challenge. But it's kind of a springboard. You're starting out with one thing and then it kind of naturally leads on to some other stuff, because wildlife doesn't happen in isolation. It works with all other kinds of wildlife in a bit of an ecosystem, so you can move from one thing to another and kind of have that natural progression of what you want to focus on. Or maybe you just choose a particular group of species each year. Maybe you want to focus on grasshoppers this year or dragonflies the next year, and just try and improve one little bit at a time, so you're building up that well-rounded knowledge. And the way that you could tie that back into your nature diary is that maybe you just want to do a small diary for each type of species. So you'd find something similar to this or smaller that you could paint a butterfly in, if that was what you decided to focus on, and you just have a page for each butterfly, and then maybe on the other side you can write some information about it, like where you saw it, the time of year that you saw it, was it on a particular food plant, and just compile your own little miniature species guide, and then the next year maybe you focus on something else. And you can just create your own little field guides as you're doing these nature diaries, because there's no rules with nature diaries. You can make them however you like. This is a bit of a compilation, so we're looking at like all of the species, or lots of the species that I'm coming across. But there's no reason you couldn't just do a nature diary where you just focus on birds or grasshoppers or butterflies or flowers. You can make it however you like and try and learn things that way, and maybe you'll find that a good introduction, and then you can move on from there. Well, thank you very much for watching this video. I think that kind of wraps things up for now. I do appreciate this has been very wildlife heavy and less intensive on the painting side of things, but it's a nature diary and that's a bit of both. Hopefully you found something helpful or useful in there somewhere. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and let me know if you're starting your own nature diary, or if you have been doing one for a while now and has that helped you to improve your ID skills. Thanks once again for watching, and I will see you next time.